I'm Barrie Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barrie.
Welcome to Back Barries from Guardian Australia. Well, it took just 2 weeks. We are now involved in the war in Iran. In a defensive role, almost a technical role, the government insists, defending our assets in the Middle East. But is it the thin edge of a wedge? We'll get to that. But at home, Matt Canavan has taken over from David Littleproud, and he now heads up the National Party. Matt Canavan has always been a big presence in the party, and when you ask the question, is he the right person to take on One Nation, you first of all, I think, have to determine what your aim is, what the tactics, what the strategy are. If your aim is to be more like One Nation, to meet them, so that the people make a judgment, well, there's no real difference, we might as well stick with what we know, or is the strategy to argue that One Nation is a menace, that they have no real solutions, and build quite a distinctive difference from them. So first of all, Tony, the strategy, what do you think they're trying to achieve? And is he the right person to achieve it?
First of all, I think it's pretty clear that David Littleproud jumped before he was pushed. He'd be aware that national polling in the seat of Farah is diabolical, probably in single digits. And of course, that's Tim Fischer's seat. Now, that was a very long time ago. Tim was last elected in 1998, finished in 2001. So basically anyone under the age of 46 has never seen Tim Fischer's name on the ballot paper, but it's an iconic seat held by two leaders, Susan Ley and Tim Fischer. So I think David Littleproud realised that if he doesn't have the numbers right now, he definitely wouldn't have had the numbers after that by-election result. So in steps Matt Canavan, and I think the most interesting thing there is, are we going to see Matt Canavan the backbencher or Matt Canavan the leader? If it's Matt Canavan the backbencher, he'll effectively become the leader of the coalition. He'll dictate policy and effectively hold the Liberal Party to ransom, which he did very effectively from the backbench, incredibly effectively. He's a very smart fellow, Canavan. He actually has no regional credentials. He grew up in Jim Chalmers' seat and studied economics and went to the Productivity Commission. So he's got a very interesting background, but no regional credibility to speak of. But of course, being leader, as you know, Barrie, you've worked for one, managing your backbench, managing relationships with coalition partners, managing relationships with donors and supporters and media is a very different scenario, and that's going to be a real test of him. And I think he's got the capacity to do it. But it depends on what audience he wants to play to. Does he want to play to their base, or does he want to expand their map?
And when you say, part of his responsibility is to manage his relationship with the Liberal Party, and that's the part that they never seem to put a whole lot of time and effort into. They just don't seem to care very much. I can understand how Matt Canavan could not necessarily save seats in Queensland, but limit the losses in Queensland. But I think it's all bad news for the Liberal Party because he's a friend of fossil fuels. He has this view that they should extend the life of fossil fuels while they still exist. I just can't see how he can make a difference in terms of helping the Liberal Party where they need to win back their seats. And he might not even care about that.
Yeah, it's going to be a question of how much of the One Nation vote can he win back versus what is he going to lose in those urban seats on behalf of the coalition. He is very clever and articulate, and I think he's more persuasive than Barnaby. I've always thought Barnaby was a little bit overrated. He's great with the clever phrase, and the media have always enjoyed that because he's good content, but I don't think he's ever persuaded people, and his numbers have been catastrophic for a long time, including in the regions where the last time we tested he was net -2. Well, that's supposed to be his base. In the metros, of course, he's like net -20-something. Canavan, though, whilst he performs very well on Sky News, the question now is he a bit of a flat track bully? Being handed a few half volleys by Andrew Bolt is not quite the same as going out and facing the press pack in Canberra. So I think he's got the capacity to do it, but does he have the want?
Does he understand that without the cities, the National Party can't be in government and therefore everything he says is merely theoretical?
I think there is a broader play going on. It's been going on for a very long time, and the merger of the LNP in Queensland, which was a very long time ago, but I think that was the start of the process to basically have a merged entity federally, which pivots to the right. I think it's a project that not just Canavan and Barnaby Joyce, but I think, it extends to people like Tony Abbott and others who have this vision. Abbott's got a reform network, I noticed online, starting up, calling on Liberal Party members to reclaim the party. So I suspect they just want to destroy, blow up the Liberal Party as it exists and remake it in their own image.
Barnaby Joyce went on Sky within a quarter of an hour or so of the new leader being announced, and he knows Matt Canavan pretty well. He employed him for a while, and he said that Canavan's policy position is 1,000,000 miles from those of the Liberal Party and 1,000,000 miles from those of his deputy. I would add to that until he was made leader, he was one dummy spit away from joining One Nation himself. Look, this is a huge policy divide that Barnaby Joyce identifies. Now, he may have done that for political purposes, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he's right on that score.
Yeah, and I saw Laura Jays, who's an excellent journalist. She has a nose for a good opportunity, and she had Barnaby on the other day, and she tried to convince him to do a weekly segment, him versus Canavan, on panel, which would be, you'd pay good money for that. The other interesting thing that I noticed, though, was Pauline Hanson herself came out and went after Canavan. I don't know whether that means that she sees that Canavan could tap into some of that vote that they've gained and bring it back. But it was unmistakable.
It might have been because he had a go at her right from the top.
Yeah.
And people were waiting to see what approach he's going to take, according to One Nation. He just basically said they're pointless.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's going to be a fascinating contest to watch and see what happens there. But those internal relationships will be very interesting.
And Darren Chester as the deputy, the one who Barnaby said is 1,000,000 miles from Matt Canavan. In Nicky Sava's book, Earthquake, somebody I think second hand, but quoted Darren Chester as saying that he was like the Japanese soldier who'd been in the jungle and only emerged years after the war.
Yeah. Chester is very good. He's a very impressive fellow.
Very progressive.
Yep. I think he was one of the first ones to come out on same-sex marriage in the National Party, which was brave, but principled. And so I'm actually a little bit surprised that he's made the rise to deputy leader. But he, that's going to be interesting again to see how that plays out.
It may be that they know that Darren Chester can be more effective in terms of winning National Party votes in Victoria and parts of New South Wales. But you can't be too cute on that. You really can't have Matt Canavan saying one thing in Queensland and Darren Chester saying something altogether different in Victoria. In this age of communication, they'll be caught out pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, this is part of the coalition's broader problem is you got some high-profile MPs going on Sky and other forums and calling for spending cuts and the government spending too much, and they go on Facebook and they say the government needs to fund this project in my electorate. So, it's that lack of a coherent narrative that I think is, part of the coalition's broader problem. And I think, before they keep on swapping leaders all the time and it's becoming like a white swan event, changing leadership in the coalition, they just need to sit down first of all and get back to their basic values and a few guiding principles for economic reform to give voters hope, especially those younger cohorts where they've disconnected from. And rather than sort of just playing this tactical game of, I think this sort of question time was a really good performance and we're going to win back some of this vote.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Farah, and you don't really give the Nationals much of a chance here, and I wouldn't give the Liberals a huge chance either. But the latest poll that I saw on this had One Nation candidate at 29 primary vote, Michelle Milthorpe, the Independent, on 25. The thing that I think is slightly overlooked here, though, is that they asked the question about the ALP as well, and they probably won't stand. So there's 9% available in primary vote to one of those two. I'd imagine Milthorpe would get the lion's share of that. So it could be, based on that poll, that Labor would Milthorpe would go into the by-election in front on primary votes, and she would have a very good chance, wouldn't she, of getting the preference vote?
Seats like Farah are very, very hard to poll because they're so expansive. And so to get a properly weighted sample with townships of a few hundred voters, to weight it properly is very, very difficult. That said, I think everything is against the coalition there. Susan Lay's primary vote was 43% last time. She didn't win a single booth in Albury, which is the major voting centre there. Millthorpe starts with 20% effectively from the last election, so that's a great head start. If she can get to mid-30s, then she's absolutely in with a chance of winning. But I think it's also, I put my money on her at the moment, but it just seems like the stars are aligning for One Nation. I think the fuel shortage, which of course will really impact seats like Farah, and it's already impacting Farah. There's a lot of Bowsers already closed, which I've seen reported in the media. That is just a gift to One Nation, I think, because it goes to those self-sufficiency messages. And that is a theme ever since COVID.
But are they going to seriously blame the Australian government for a shortage of fuel during a war in Iran?
Yeah, but I think it taps into that grievance, and that theme of self-sufficiency and supply chains has been there ever since COVID, where people are like, what do you mean we don't have these medical supplies? We've got to import them from China, which is, all shut down at the moment. And Hasty's been trying to tap into that a bit. Don't underestimate how powerful that is at the moment for a lot of Australians, that sense of self-sufficiency. Now, there's overwhelming economic arguments as to why Australia can't store most of this fuel, and I've noticed Abbott has been very quiet lately because, of course, the final two refineries closed under his government. It wasn't because of him. It was a 25-year process where it was uneconomical to maintain them, especially with environmental regulations, but the cost of it. And so consequently, we only have about 30 days reserve. But, mate, when you're the government, it's your problem to deal with. And what Australian voters really hate right now, which is why they're running to minor parties, is this hatred of the two-party system where, they blame one another or sort of try and make excuses. Albanese came out and Bowen and said, there's no problem. And 24 hours later, they said, okay, we're fixing the problem, which was a mixed message. It's a response, which is good, but it's not ideal for an incumbent government who probably aren't going to run in that seat. But to tap into that sense of grievance and frustration with both major parties, I think it's fodder.
The South Australian election, of course, is just over a week away now, and you just get the feeling that if they woke up, the Liberal Party woke up on Sunday morning to the headline that the Liberals still have a pulse, they'd probably take it. It just, they must be facing this with genuine trepidation.
Yeah. I think when we first started this podcast, we were talking about how it was going to be an extinction-level event in South Australia. The Liberal Party's got massive structural problems over there. Alex Antic and the right have effectively hollowed out the party, including professionally. And Peter Malinauskas is a political athlete. He is the real deal as far as a political performer goes.
He's not without an issue at the moment, though.
Yeah, and I think this is a classic summary of where we're at in Australian politics right now. He won on 4 years ago on ramping and hospital beds. And as you know, Barry, if you start a campaign on day one talking about an issue, and in this case for Malinauskas it was ramping, and you finish 33 days later still talking about the same issue, then you're probably going to win through just reach and repetition. And that is his one vulnerability electorally, is that was his single reason for vote considerations. However, ramping on all the statistics has been getting worse under his watch, and a story blew up hugely in Adelaide a week and a half ago, where the health minister, in response to the very sad passing of a fellow called Stephen King, subsequently released to the media emails sent to the Premier's office from a fellow also called Stephen King, but it was a case of mistaken identity. So putting aside the complete outrageousness of a breach of privacy and treating it like a PR problem instead of a policy problem, Picton, to his credit, came out very quickly and apologised and said it was a mistake. But at a time when they should have the Labor government on the rack on this issue, it is the one thing that Malinauskas does not want to be talking about with a week and a half to go. Instead, the Liberal Party are talking about themselves again, because they have had a candidate running in the seat of Wright, which is not a winnable seat, but he works in headquarters. He's a paid campaign professional. And perhaps not uncoincidentally, as the time this Picton story broke, comments that he made on an American podcast, evangelical podcast, have come out.
Where he said in part that he actually witnessed a witch melt in church, right?
Yeah, and that was probably the least concerning thing that he said.
The rest
that I can live with.
The rest was horrible.
It was the feminism and homosexuality is demonic.
Yep.
The fact that a paid campaign professional, when he nominated for the seat, which is to fly the flag, there's no expectation of winning. But for a paid professional to go, oh, hang on a sec, guys, there's probably a few things I've said that, might be considered controversial, so perhaps I shouldn't nominate.
Maybe it didn't occur to him that it was controversial.
Yeah, I suspect that's probably the case.
The problem though, isn't it, when a party starts to disintegrate, they not only have trouble getting the right candidates, really good candidates to contest winnable seats. This kind of thing goes on in the seats they can't win, because you want to fill the whole table, don't you? You want a candidate in every seat, so you've got to find somebody who is prepared to run and lose, and that's when people like this emerge.
Yeah, especially over there now, because public funding is now so huge. It's a major part of the political apparatus. So the problem for the South Australian Liberals is that private donations are now basically eliminated, and they will get funding based on their primary vote, which will be catastrophic. And so that means that is effectively funding for the next campaign. So instead of being 40% primary vote or 35 or something like that, it could potentially be around 15%.
We'll move on now to the war, and it's look, the government right from the start has been cautious, I suppose, careful in its positioning, maybe too careful in the sense that it could have nuanced its original support for the conflict, because others managed to do that. Canada, in particular, I think, by saying that we can understand why this is happening, but we don't think it's legal. Australia went all in. But they are saying it's defensive, it's technical in terms of the involvement. When you talk thin edge of the wedge thing, I can recall, when first Australian advisors went into Vietnam, and even then there was a sense of foreboding, a sense of inevitability, advisors on the ground. It won't be long before there are forces involved as well. I don't really get that sense this time. I think that there's a separate consideration. There's a thought going around that why is Australia doing this, or why are they defending the UAE? There are 24,000 Australians living and working in the UAE, so we not only have defence assets to protect, but we have a lot of Australians living there.
Yeah, and it's a booming economies. Australia is the beneficiary of that, either through expats working over there, but also great trade partners on many levels. This is an entirely disruptive campaign so far, and you just get the sense that Trump is just making it up as he goes. The messaging is all over the shop. It's not a war; it's a mission. Yeah. Heggs have then sort of declared it. I think he did a press conference saying, they started this war, which is not entirely obvious to me, but it's also, goes to that sort of complete chaos and confusion, which Trump thrives on. That's his sweet spot, is chaos and confusion. But we still go back to that problem of, one of his major pitches to the electorate was that he was the only president since Jimmy Carter, I think, who hadn't started a war.
Somebody pointed out the other day that if you were writing War and Peace from the beginning now, the title military involvement in peace wouldn't really have the same ring about it, would it? But look, he will give you a deadline on the war, a sense that it's ending, just to manipulate the markets. Now, how long can you keep doing that before the markets don't even respond to it? I want to raise one thing that Penny Wong said, though, in terms of Australia defending its position on the war. And she said this week that it's for the United States and Israel to explain the legal basis of both the conflict and the actions they take. It's for them. I just think from the outset when they took this position, surely they made assumptions of their own. They made assumptions about the legality of the actions and how it would be defensible over time. I don't think you can just dismiss it by saying, well, we were in, but the US and Israel can explain their actions. It's I'm not sure that's got much of a lifespan either. And on oil, of course, this is going to be. We talked about that earlier anyway in respect to the Farah by-election, what One Nation might do with the issue. But the two things the government can do is keep an eagle eye on price gouging for a start. That's something they should be doing. But other than that, they just have to do everything they possibly can to release reserves and try and keep the fuel flowing.
With this war doesn't end mission, in the next week, then you're going to start seeing catastrophic implications for the global economy.
Well, I do want to talk about a couple of things before we wind up. Dennis Richardson bailing out of the Royal Commission into anti-Semitism and just a word on the final judgment on Robodebt, but we'll take a break. Right, we're back, and just a program note that Back Barries, that's us, we'll be conducting a live event at this year's Sydney Writers' Festival. It'll be a breakfast recording of the program. It'll be on Thursday, May 21. So you can go to the Sydney Writers' Festival website for bookings. We got an email this week from Philip Orgill, who starts out by saying that he enjoys the program and he thinks we're two very articulate and informed presenters, Tony, and that he likes the fact that you update polling stats. It's a magic combo. I don't know why we chose his email, but here's the point. He says that he and his wife have had 17 years in the Middle East, and he has friends in the UAE and in Tehran. And he's also a boomer, and he agrees with last week's comments on the United States interventions over the years in international conflicts. And I just like that coming from him, from someone who's lived in the region, that he sees parallels with this particular experience. Dennis Richardson, his decision to quit, I think the background of this needs to be kind of pointed out, that he was appointed to head up a review specifically into the intelligence services and whether they might have made errors in the run-up to the terrorism attack at Bondi. He was appointed at a time when the government was still resisting a Royal Commission. And then the Royal Commission was established, and the idea was to fold Dennis Richardson into that. What happened from then on was a failure in process, undoubtedly a failure in process, that it either didn't occur to them or they didn't think they needed to deal with the fact that there were questions around that. What if Dennis Richardson makes his own findings, his own recommendations by April? That was his deadline. What happens to those? Will they stand the test of time? Will they be released at the interim report? Well, apparently they had these internal discussions, and the Royal Commission had decided that there wouldn't be recommendations and findings in the interim report. And you can understand why that would have frustrated him, because, as he said, he was now surplus to requirements, that he felt like a researcher. And, you know, those findings now, he obviously felt there was a sense of urgency about them. And now there's even a question as to whether they would survive the whole legal process that is to come with the Royal Commission. And, you know, 7 or 8 months from now, they could disappear. So you can understand his frustrations around that. It was just poorly handled in that sense. Yeah,
Paul Sakal broke that story this week about the Royal Commission resisting, Virginia Bell resisting his recommendations at this point. Dennis Richardson, I think it's worth noting, is one of the more respected and celebrated public servants in Australia by both sides. In fact, Kevin Rudd appointed him as the head of DFAT when he was Prime Minister, and as we know, that is Kevin Rudd's passion project, his foreign affairs, so that's not something he would have done without weeks of thought. But he's held in incredibly high regard, and I think that's one of the reasons why Albanese appointed him straight away, because he thought this is somebody who both sides respect enormously and won't be causing any sort of conflict in the media about his appointment. So it was a huge move for him to resign. I think he did it as neatly as possible and as professionally as he possibly could. But the briefing coming out to Paul Sakal was pretty telling.
Yeah, I think when you say how he handled it afterwards, there would have been a danger that to walk away from something like this would be seen as a bit churlish. But he went out there and did a lot of media in a single day. He stood up there and took all the questions and was quite frank. Look, I have to declare an interest. I worked with Dennis Richardson one stage. I've socialised with Dennis Richardson. And what I know of him is that, like, when he gave up full-time work 8 or 9 years ago, he probably didn't really know what lay ahead, but he's taken lots of responsibilities like this. He's the sort of person that if the Prime Minister phones up and wants something done, he would say yes. You know, he'd feel a kind of an obligation to do it. So it would have been a big step for him to step away as he did. The Robodebt final finding as the National Anti-Corruption Commission, they had 6 people referred to it for examination. One of them was Scott Morrison, as it turned out. He was cleared. 2 public servants, it was found, were engaged in serious corrupt conduct, but there won't be any prosecution around that. But I just want to say about that the government did pursue hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, the figures are 470,000. That's almost 500,000 people were wrongly issued with debt notices and were repaid in full. And another 200,000 were still under review, or they had that review waived. And it just seems to me the language used around it at the time, that it was a strike force, they were going to aggressively target fraud. And when people received these notices, a lot of them had no idea of what it was, the money that was owed. They had no knowledge of it. They were astonished and they were traumatised and they didn't know how to deal with it. So it just seems to me in the end that no corruption on the part of any of the politicians involved, but I think it's fair to say it was unforgivable and morally reprehensible. It was driven by a massive indifference to those who were affected and impacted, and also I think driven by an obsession to exploit the so-called welfare cheats issue. We should never forget it.
But I think what concerns me the most about that report this week is that the likes of Alan Tudge had his reputation shredded, and quite rightly so. On a number of different issues, he's had his reputation shredded. But the 2 public servants referred to in that report, where they said there was evidence of corruption, I mean, they should be hauled. They should be hauled before courts, because there is a real question mark there. I think, for listeners who don't know, these departments receive all sorts of pitches from private companies with software ideas that, and Robodebt was obviously one of those ways to capture, money that was perceived to be wrongly paid. And public servants make an assessment and then recommend it to the minister, and the buck stops at the minister, and that they've had their reputation shredded. But there's real question marks as to the role of the public servants in this. And I'm very disappointed that the Commission hasn't progress that forward.
Yeah, but the finding wasn't that the public servants had been unfair. The allegation was that they knew what they were doing was illegal, and it went ahead anyway. Well, that's it for this week. Just a reminder that we will be at the Sydney Writers' Festival on Thursday, May 21, so you can look that one up. This podcast was made on the sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri people. It was produced by Charisma Luthria and Joe Koenig, and video production Burton Awin.
The executive producer is Hannah Parks.
I'm Barrie Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barrie, and this is Back Barries, a Guardian Australia podcast.